First of all, this is quite an endeavor to unearth a really comprehensive and long history. As they said, it goes back to the 12th century, of the idea of faithful execution throughout a number of different domains. In doing so, I think that I really want to applaud their methods of using history. So they start out with looking at the founding moment and ratification debates and kind of conventional legal sources that we would look to try to ascertain and establish original meaning. But they also then look back at a much broader set of historical materials, looking at the English context and how that alters, but also looking at the ways in which faithful execution or some idea of faithfulness in office applies within the colonial American context from the early 17th century through the late 18th century. So this is really a very comprehensive account of how this concept developed. And it's also, I think, really, as they demonstrate, a crucial area in terms of understanding the broader questions structurally of how the president and Congress should be conceived within the constitutional context and what the respective powers of president and Congress might be. I think they also tap in a nice way to a literature that they mentioned, which is this literature of constitutional fiduciaries, but also maybe more implicitly a broader kind of literature that's emerging about the relation between the history of the corporation and of the emergence of corporations and the history of constitutions and how those two things might be connected. And there is, I think, a very interesting emerging literature on that. So I have two kind of main points that I just want to press them on a bit. And the first one has to do with the method. I mean, I think that their method is really very rigorous and impressive. But I felt like it somewhat underplayed some of the discontinuities within the historical framework that they're talking about in the historical trajectory. And that discontinuity might sort of unearth different grounds for thinking about faithfulness and what faithful execution might mean. So one line that they don't really raise that I was thinking about in the background here, and that's been looked at by some others who are looking at the relation between the history of the corporation and constitutions, is a kind of Roman law origin. And certainly faithfulness sounds a little bit in a kind of Latin vein where we think about bona fide or bona fides. And in the European context, there's some literature on the relation of good faith with a kind of Roman law concept in the contractual domain. So I was curious about Roman law origins here. And then also there was another kind of backdrop that I think wasn't really mentioned that much, which is a natural law backdrop. And that might also maybe give us a little bit of pause about, kind of the relation of this to contemporary constitutional interpretation. We have, there are obviously natural law elements in the Constitution, and often we wind up kind of not really addressing those as much as we might because of the suspicion that many people have about natural law today. And I'm thinking in particular about Daniel Lee, a political theorist, argument about how the monarch was conceived in 16th and 17th century France and England, and the idea of a kind of natural law obligation, that there was a fiduciary duty, but in a natural law vein, not in a kind of common law or other vein. So those are two kind of background ideas that might be somewhat different from the material that's being discussed in the paper right now. And then also in terms of discontinuity, I think I was surprised a little bit about the treatment of the relation between the moment before the English Civil War and the English Civil War, because certainly at the moment of the English Civil War and during the Protectorate, there's a lot of emphasis on reforming judicial officers and reforming officers regulating the law and regulating the people kind of executing the law, but that's kind of in response to a problem that had been going on before. And so there is a sense maybe there was some form of faithful execution before, but there is really, I think, a difference at that moment. And then also the final area here where I see some discontinuity is there's a discussion about the colonies in the 17th century, and then a kind of acknowledgement that most of them become crown colonies in the 18th century. But I think that when you think about the colonies moving to being crown colonies, there's a difference when governors are from earlier notions of fidelity, because their fidelity is going to be to either parliamentary statutes or also to the crown rather than to colonial legislation. So there's a different kind of relation going on there. And I guess that brings me to my second set of points, which are about kind of the implications of this for understanding the Constitution today. And part of that, I think, hinges on how much latitude we think faithful really gives us, right? So how much latitude is faithfully suggesting. And there are a couple of, often in the paper it seems like it's not that much latitude, but then there are a couple of quotes that suggest more latitude. So on page 49, there's a quote, "So as they be not contrary." And then on page 90, the governor of Virginia is supposed to ensure that law and justice in mercy be executed, right? So that suggests that there is some, I mean, maybe this goes back to the earlier discussion of equity, but there is some latitude here, and that seems consistent with the story that someone like Mary Builder tells about the relation of the colonies with England, where there is some latitude. There is supposed to be conformity to the laws of England, but not absolute conformity. It's conformity in relation to the circumstances that are existing in the colonies. And so that Privy Council review only gets rid of things that are clearly in violation of English law, rather than kind of in a murky territory, maybe the territory of construction. I don't know. So I guess that question then kind of brings me to, what I found persuasive and less persuasive about the derivation for today. And so I think, Ethan really emphasized the idea that faithful execution isn't an affirmative source of power. And I think this paper really effectively demonstrates that. So I think that it effectively suggests a structural argument about Article 2 that's similar to what we hear about kind of enumerated powers in Article 1, or the refusal to interpret the necessary and proper clause as giving plenary power to Congress. So a sort of general structural principle about how we should construe executive powers. And then the question is really kind of how much additional mileage is it possible to get from this material. And to me, I'm not entirely sure. They emphasize the idea that a lot of these injunctions about faithful execution have to do with subordinate officers, but they seem to be subordinate officers in a number of different contexts. And here, with respect to the Constitution, there's faithful execution of the laws, but if we think about who the debt is owed to, it's to the laws, but also to, say, the legislators or to Congress, but then also to the people, because the Constitution is created by we the people. And in some of these contexts, I'm not sure there's that kind of triangulation in relation to faithful execution. So that's all I have, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Excellent. You want to respond at all to the...
Yeah, just really quickly. I mean, mostly we're here to hear what you guys think. But on the question about how much latitude or how much discretion is allowed when somebody's under a requirement of faithful execution, I think we believe a fair amount, and that's kind of in some ways the point, that in a world without develop bureaucratic, control of government officers, where transportation is slow. People might be, very far away from, from a center of governmental authority and just out on their own doing their job. This oath and these commands were sort of one of the things in the toolbox to try to get people to, essentially take a highly religious, statement and promise to not steal, do their job well, not discriminate between people, but to impartially, carry out the law, et cetera. So I don't think we view the faithful execution commands as overly constraining. We see them as kind of tools for a world where there is necessarily some discretion, and this is trying to just limit the ends for which it can be used and put some limits on that, but not too many.